about homelessness and how to end it. There are lots of misconceptions out there about homelessness. People think that folks choose to live on the streets, or that they're there because of their own behavior, or they figure there's nothing to be done. The poor are always with us. The problem is too complex to solve. But actually, the truth is pretty simple. Widespread homelessness in good economic times is a relatively recent phenomenon. It arose when low-wage workers could no longer afford the rent. And research has given us solutions that are proven to work, if we're willing to fund them. I'm old enough to recall my shocked disbelief when homelessness began to spill out of Skid Rows and into the nation's consciousness and cities. Back in 1970, there was a small surplus of housing units that poor people could afford, and there was very little homelessness. One book at the time was entitled Old Men, Drunk and Sober, because that homelessness was largely confined to that group of older white men living on Skid Rows. Many social scientists thought that when those men passed, homelessness would end. But it didn't end. Housing costs rose, wages failed to keep up, and that surplus of housing units became a bigger and bigger deficit. We began to see new groups of people on the street: young men, minorities, women, and even families. Today, homelessness looks pretty different from most people's stereotypes. For example, can any of you guess at what age a person is most likely to be in a homeless shelter in the United States? Any guesses? 16. Anybody else? 60? 16, 60? 31. 31? 25, did I hear? You're nowhere close. Infancy is the age at which a person is most likely to stay in a homeless shelter. Babies are a blessing, but they're also a financial burden. They outgrow their clothes every time you turn around. And more importantly, they take a parent or someone else out of the workforce to care for them. Or they require the parent to pay for costly childcare. Rates of shelter use stay high in the preschool years, and then they drop somewhat when children get to public school age and childcare expenses drop. They stay comparatively low during the school years, and they rise again in early adulthood when some of those young adults are parents of some of those young children. So when you think about the face of homelessness in the United States, you need to think not only about men like this, whom you might encounter on the streets, but about babies like this. I was a young mom in the late 1980s, and I didn't know what to say when my kids tugged on my sweater and said, "Mommy, what is that person doing there, sleeping on the street?" At the end of the decade, the New York Times ran an editorial series about homelessness that they dubbed New Calcutta. Wags complained with some justice that the Times was unfair to Calcutta. But the point of the metaphor was clear. How, the Times asked, could homelessness be happening here in a wealthy country? The answer is that it doesn't need to happen. We know how to end homelessness. We know how to prevent it among people who are at high risk. We know how to stop generating more. We don't have to go picking our way around our fellow citizens on our street, pretending or wishing that they weren't there. The country is wealthy enough to house all of us. What it takes is political will. At base, homelessness comes about because poor people can't afford the rent. Rates of homelessness are highest in cities where rents are highest. And rental subsidies that make housing affordable both prevent and end it. I co-led a big study of over 2,200 families that we found in homeless shelters in 12 sites across the United States. We used a lottery to offer them different programs to end their homelessness. And then we looked at what happened over the next 3 years. What we found is that offering families a rental subsidy that held their housing costs to 30% of their income not only ended homelessness, but had radiating benefits for other aspects of family life. Rental subsidies reduced food insecurity and domestic violence. They reduced psychological distress and substance abuse. That is, problems that are sometimes causes of homelessness were reduced when families had access to affordable housing. Rental subsidies reduced separation of parents from children, and they improved kids' school attendance and behavior. Families who had affordable housing could use that as a platform to solve whatever other problems they might have had on their own. As one mom from Kansas City put it, for me to have a nice house for our children without having to worry about rent for this month, because my husband's trying to go back to school full-time and so am I. This way we know we're supported and we don't have to worry about losing the house because we're trying to go to school and to work and we're safe. We're okay, and we'll get things back on track. Formerly homeless families flourished without any additional social services. But what about people with mental illnesses or substance use disorders? It's certainly true that a mental illness or other disability may interfere with a person's ability to earn enough to pay the rent. But why should the penalty for mental illness be homelessness? The answer is that federal SSI disability benefits at $794 a month are too low to pay the rent. And I don't deny that in some cases, substance abuse causes homelessness. In other cases, people don't hit the bottle until after they hit the street. But I'm a college professor, so let me let you in on a secret. You may not know this, but a lot of college students abuse substances. And no one ever says that they became college students because of their substance abuse. Way too many Americans abuse substances. You probably know some of them. Most of them don't become homeless. Substance use disorders, like other mental illnesses, can be managed and in some cases reduced when people have access to stable housing. Shelters are not the answer here, but supportive housing, that is, affordable housing with associated social services, has been shown to work, and to work well. Let me tell you about a woman in New York. I'll call her Susan. Susan had a mental illness, and she loved her cat. She wouldn't go to shelters because they don't take pets. Susan found a friend who would keep her cat, and Susan lived in the stairwell of the friend's apartment building. When the friend's husband left in the morning, Susan was permitted to come indoors, clean up, and play with her cat. You might say that Susan chose to live in that stairwell, but when she was offered an apartment where she could keep her cat, she jumped at the opportunity. Susan was lucky to get into a program called Pathways Housing First that gives people with long histories of homelessness, serious mental illnesses, co-occurring substance problems, apartments, independent apartments with private landlords without any prerequisites for sobriety or participation in treatment. The program offers wraparound services, medical, psychiatric, substance services, vocational, recreational services, 24/7 support. But only those services that people choose, because services work a lot better when people choose them than when they're foisted on folks. When we did a study comparing Pathways Housing First to programs that require people to be clean and sober and to demonstrate their housing readiness before they're allowed indoors, the Pathways group got housed faster and they stayed housed longer. They had 99 fewer days homeless on average in the first year alone. Other researchers have followed people in Housing First programs for up to 5 years to show that people with serious mental illnesses and substance use disorders can remain stably housed. Programs like these and some others allowed the country to cut homelessness among military veterans nearly in half between 2010 and 2019, at a time when homelessness among other groups barely budged. The Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Veterans Affairs put in the resources. And mayors made housing veterans in their cities a priority. But no one offered the same level of supports to other groups. So we know how to end homelessness, but we also have to stop generating more. Even before COVID-19, the Department of Housing and Urban Development reported that there were 7.7 million very low-income households paying more than half of their incomes for housing. With so many at risk, a variety of trigger events, a medical crisis, a job loss, a flood, an eviction, or even a quarrel with someone who's provided them housing, will pitch some people into homelessness. Because housing affordability depends on incomes and on housing costs, anything that raises incomes for people on the lowest rungs of the economic ladder or reduces housing costs will reduce homelessness. Strategies to even out fluctuations in income will lead to fewer crises that send some people into shelters or onto the streets. And because racial discrimination puts African Americans and Native Americans at special risk, combating discrimination in housing, employment, incarceration, and the accumulation of assets will also reduce homelessness. There are lots of ways to raise incomes. We can raise the minimum wage. Right now, there's no place in the country where a full-time, year-round minimum wage worker can afford the fair market rent for a two-bedroom apartment. And there are precious few places where that full-time, year-round worker can afford a one-bedroom. We can enhance the Earned Income Tax Credit. That's a program that provides a small bonus for every dollar that a poor worker earns. And we can make it more generous to people without children. We can increase SSI disability benefits to the point where someone with a serious mental illness or other disability that precludes work can still afford the dignity of a modest apartment. We can extend the temporary child tax credit that was part of the stimulus and make it permanent. There are also lots of ways to reduce housing costs. The closest thing we have to a silver bullet to end homelessness would be an expansion of the Housing Choice Voucher Program to all the households that are poor enough to be eligible. That's the rental subsidy program that holds households' housing expenses to 30% of their income. Right now, there's funding for only about 1 in 4 eligible households, and waiting lists are long. We also need to build more affordable housing and make it less expensive to build by zoning changes that allow multifamily housing in more places. And we need to enforce existing laws against racial discrimination in housing and pass new laws to prohibit a landlord from discriminating against a tenant simply because the tenant plans to use a housing voucher to pay part of the rent. Homelessness is the worst manifestation of inequality in our society that puts housing out of reach for too many Americans. That inequality that leads some to live in mansions while others live in the streets is a consequence of social policies that we can change. Homelessness is thus a choice, not by the people living on the streets, but by the rest of us when we turn the other way. Thank you.